Welcome, everybody. We're so glad that you have joined us. This is a really special webinar. We're going to be talking about delaying alcohol use in adolescence. And I'm Scott Holdman. I'm going to be your host throughout this event today. And just want to let you know that this is a new webinar series from Level Up Fargo, and it's presented in partnership with the Matto Foundation and Dakota Medical Foundation. These are free monthly series, and they're designed to address youth substance use and the many challenges, issues that young people face, especially during a time of uncertainty. This is going to be the first Thursday of every month at noon. We'll be offering these hour-long interactive discussions for parents, coaches, teachers, and caring adults in the community. So be sure to follow Level Up Fargo and Matto Foundation on Facebook for upcoming webinar announcements. And before we dive into this, I want to introduce Andrea. Andrea, could you tell us just a little bit more about what today is going to be about, this series, and about Level Up and Matto?
Absolutely. Thank you, Scott. Welcome, everybody. We're so glad to have you join us today. This is going to be a very important conversation, and it's really about the importance of delaying alcohol use in adolescents. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing Dr. Hanisch and from Mike and Mary Beth Traynor and sharing their story. So I'm glad you're here with us today, and I hope you enjoy the discussion. I'm going to turn it back over to Scott here in a few minutes, but just want to let you know, if you have any questions, please feel free to add them into the chat. Someone will be monitoring them, and we will be answering those as we go on. So Scott, I turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to introduce today's panel and who we'll be discussing with today. We've got Dr. Stefanie Hanisch. Now, Dr. Stefanie Hanisch is a board-certified child and adolescent psychiatrist. She serves as the department chair for child behavioral health at Sanford Health in Fargo. And so she's going to be our expert today, and she's going to help to lend her expert lens on what's happening through Mike and Mary Beth Traynor, who are going to share their story about losing their son Matthew to addiction. Dr. Hanisch, I just want to start with you. Thank you for making time for joining us today.
God, it's my pleasure. I'm so pleased to be here.
And Mike and Mary Beth Traynor, thank you once again for making time and telling your story. And so before we dive into your story, I'm going to start with you, Mary Beth. Could you just give an introduction to a little bit about who you are?
I'm Mary Beth Traynor, co-founder of the Matto Foundation, and I am Matto's mom.
Well, wonderful. And we're so glad that you're here. And Dr. Traynor, would you mind just a short introduction about yourself so people can get to know you before we dive into your story?
So Mike Traynor, Mary Beth's husband, and Matto was my son, so I'm his dad. And I'm happy to be here with this group to work on this important project. Thank you for putting this together for all of us.
Well, we're so glad that you're both here. And let's start with you, Mary Beth. Could you take us to the beginning? I've got a few photos here of Matthew, but let's just start before addiction or any of those things happen. Just tell us a little bit about Matthew.
Matthew, the middle of three boys. He and his older brother, Michael, were almost exactly 2 years in age apart. And then Tim, the youngest, he was 4.5 years younger than Matthew. And we did everything as a family, as you can see, took them on many excursions around the United States. And they were all great buddies, the three boys. Matthew in particularly loved fishing. He loved to hang out with his dad. And he loved fishing and hunting and other sports too, but nothing as much as fishing and hunting. They were his passions, and he could do them all day long.
Well, and what kind of child was Matthew growing up?
Matthew, I think of all of the three children, he was very gregarious and the people would kind of gravitate to him because of his smile and his eyes, and he definitely just liked being Matthew, a normal kid. And even one of his bosses said, he worked out on a golf course, said he is just always so friendly. He was always so friendly and could talk with anybody and make them feel good and so accommodating. You know, Matthew, being the middle child, was had just an infectious laugh, and he tended to get everybody wound up. And he had a nickname for everybody. He called Tim, our youngest one, Fat Boy Slim, all the time. And he called me Mama D. Franklin. So one of our chocolate labs is now named Mom Franklin, after Matthew's constant names for us. And he always brought levity to a situation. He was funny and just such a creative young man.
Well, and Dr. Traynor, you know, when you think of your son, Matthew, you know, what images and thoughts come to mind? Just to share a little bit more about what type of kid Matthew was and a little bit about his character.
Well, I think these pictures that you put up kind of show what kind of kid he was. He was a normal kid. And, you know, we thought it was a normal family, but maybe not, depending on who you talk to. But, you know, he not only loved the outdoors, but he was also a big sports fan. He was a great basketball player, great soccer player. Any athletic thing, he could just pick it up and go right with it. He was a big University of North Dakota fan, because most of his growing up years was in Grand Forks, and he loved Michigan College. You know, he was a big Wolverine fan. You can see by his hats that he always wore. But you know, I was thinking about when you put up all these pictures of Matthew and his family. My office looks the same way. I've got pictures of my family, which is you know, the most important thing in my life. And you know, we lost Matthew, so it takes, when you lose a child, it takes part of your life away from you. And you know, a lot of the things that Matthew liked to do, I like to do as well, like hunting and fishing. And you know, for me, everything about those things reminds me of him. And sometimes it's a struggle for me to do them. In fact, my wife, who normally didn't want me to go hunting, is telling me, you need to go fishing, you know, because I think she thinks it's good for my own mental health. But I can tell you, Matthew was just as normal as probably any other kid on the block. And unfortunately, he started down the wrong path when he was, you know, a young man, probably about 14 or so. And his life basically unraveled after that.
Well, for those that are just joining us live, we're here with Mike and Mary Beth Traynor, who have lost a son to addiction, and we're here with Dr. Stefanie Hanisch. And just so you know, we're going to be entering into a sensitive topic, and so, you know, we may shed some tears, and that's okay, and we embrace that, and that's part of the journey that we're on together. And I think a big part of the message that we want to share here is that it can happen to anyone. And so about 14 years old, things start to change. And so Mary Beth, can you tell us how the trail started to turn from this creative, imaginative son of yours, how you started to see some maybe darker elements creep into his life?
I think I did forget to mention too that Matthew is a very bright kid. And part of it is, you know, he and Michael being 2 years apart, they were in high school at the same time. And, you know, we'd started to see some things changed from maybe 8th, 9th grade, but by the time he was a senior, or sophomore, I'm sorry, in high school, that's when we really noticed it. And I would tell you that his brother Michael would say that too, because they were very close. However, they were growing apart, and he noticed things. And one of the telltale signs too is, for me and for both Mike and I, were his grades. And a teacher came up to me who knew him and said, because I also work in the schools, said to me that, Matthew got half wrong on his history test, which just is not like him. And she said, he just didn't seem like everything was, on all cylinders. And, we even noticed that in his basketball games too, that, he was very good at basketball and he'd travel. There was times that you were just like, something is wrong. So we were worried about him, and Michael talked to us a few times about some things he was noticing. And one day he said to me, I said, well, I'll give you a ride home from school, because Michael had something to do. And he said, oh yeah, well, I'm going to be down working in the weight room. So I don't know what prompted me, but I went down to the weight room and he wasn't there. So I thought, I looked around at some of his classmates weren't there. So I waited and watched the parking lot, and he came into the school, and I was standing there. And of course his friends scattered. And I said, Matthew, you need to get in the car. We're going to go home. Oh no, I'm going to go to the weight room. I said, no, you're going home. So we got in the car and I drove right to the Flying J, where they have a drug testing site. It's in the back. And I knew this because of my dealings with the schools, that it was there. And he was very resistant. I said, nope, we're going in here. I'm, worried about what's going on with you. And sure enough, he tested positive for cocaine and marijuana. And that continued to lead us down, quite a path. And I call it epic almost. From the time all of that started, it just is a whirlwind, and was very difficult for all of us. It was in and out of treatment. He ended up changing schools. I don't think he would have even graduated from high school because he was in jail. We were going through the flood, and he was let out of treatment and was arrested for selling marijuana, and he was in jail in Bismarck, and we were fighting a flood in Fargo because we lived on the river, and just because of connections that Mike and I had, we were able to help facilitate that he graduate high school in jail. And I think my message to parents too, through all this, is you as a parent set goals when you have these little bundles of joy and younger, and you have these goals. They're going to do this, and they're going to do this, and then they're going to graduate from high school. But it quickly became apparent to us that maybe not even be able to happen.
Well, can you tell us too, Mary Beth, at that single moment, it seems like a bit of mother's intuition, certainly some of your experience and education. What were you really thinking when you kind of knew to take action to bring him? What was the thing that kind of tilted you towards that this was serious enough, I needed to go get him tested?
Well, Mike and I had been talking, And then I called him and I said, okay, Matthew, he hasn't been going down, because I asked the weight coach. Oh no, he never comes in here. So and we talked about it, and he said, yeah. He goes, can you just take him to get tested? I said, yeah, I know where I can go. And so that was the first time that that we really knew what was really going on. And from there, oh man, he practically rewrote the testing for Prairie St. John's because he was so convincing that he wasn't using cocaine. And it's interesting that you make connections through all this that are lifetime and are changing for you, because Dr. Hanisch, she was a psychiatrist we took Matthew to, and she knew, and we knew, he had some underlying mental health issues. He did have some anxiety, he really liked to be home and be with us always. And so she, saw him and connected us with psychologists who would see him, and she would see him, and she was very forthcoming with him and with us. And now, Dr. Hanisch is on the Matto Foundation, and she's been so helpful over the years for our healing.
Well, and Dr. Hanisch, could you talk about, this is a really special conversation we get to have here, because not only are you a professional, but you treated Matthew. So could you share from your perspective, meeting him and treating him, sort of what are factors that we should all be looking for to, realize that we should maybe be taking things a bit more serious, like Mary Beth Traynor did?
Yeah, Scott, let me, if I may, just begin by saying, in response to what Mary Beth said, this has been a journey, and I wanted to say how grateful I am to the trainers for their generosity in sharing their story and including me in this journey and this story, and it's been very, very humbling for me to be a part of that, and I will always be grateful to them for that. What we should all be looking for, Mary Beth, I think, said it well. Kids, for better or for worse, come with a grading system. They go to school. All of them are required to go to school. So one of the first things that is often amiss is the grades. Grades change. Grades deteriorate. And so it's oftentimes teachers, it's parents, if they're paying attention, can tell that something is amiss. There's also other things, of course. There's a decrease in participating in activities that they used to enjoy. Could be sports, could be other hobbies. Changes in peer groups is also a big one, though we certainly do hear of kids whose entire peer group goes down the wrong path. The other big one that I hear a lot from parents is just a change in kids' moods. They become irritable. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of fighting, arguing, and more, even especially now, and the current situation is not helping any of this, but withdrawing. Parents saying, I never see them anymore. They don't want to come out of their bedroom. And part of that is because their lives are connected to the screen now, even for school. But just the irritability, the arguing, the withdrawing from family and previously enjoyed activities. Parents often know when something is amiss early on, and sometimes we don't want to see it. But any of those things can be early warning signs. Sometimes it's kids tend to, in adolescence, adolescents have a reputation of being irritable and being difficult and having an attitude and being oppositional, and some of that is developmentally appropriate, but there is a fine line. It's always I think behooves us as caring adults, as caregivers and parents to err on the side of caution and make sure you check in frequently.
Well, and I think this is an important distinction is, when is it serious and we got to do more and when is it not? Could you tell us a little bit, Dr. Hanisch, about what's happening even just developmentally, as an adolescent, brain is forming, what are they thinking, doing, what's happening at this time period, specifically maybe where people start to go down this path around their teen years, where they start making these types of decisions that could be very destructive.
So the human brain doesn't fully develop and mature until the early to mid-20s, and in particular, the part of the brain that's called the frontal lobe, and more specifically the prefrontal cortex, lags behind all other areas, and that's the area that's involved in things like planning, impulse control, all those things that we call executive functioning, things that we expect adults to be able to do and have, but adolescents really just don't. And as a result of that, adolescents' respond very differently to alcohol in particular and substances in general. One important distinction is that they don't have the same response that adults do as far as loss of motor control, sedation. So adults will sometimes use that as an internal cue as, oh, I've maybe had too much to drink. They're finding it a little bit hard. The fine motor coordination isn't there. I'm a little tired. Maybe I'm slurring my words a little bit. Adolescents don't typically experience that as early on, which means that they keep drinking until their blood alcohol levels are much higher. What it does do in adolescence is it affects memory and learning much more significantly than it does adults. And so all of the risk-taking behaviors that is hardwired in kids anyway, wanting to assert themselves, wanting to see what they can get away with, the types of behaviors that eventually hopefully will lead to their independence, but really takes on this additional dangerous aspect when they're under the influence of substances.
Well, it really, remarkable for us to start to understand that, because it's like, kids and adults don't react the same to using these substances. And certainly if you're expecting them to act like the adults, their brains haven't formed enough to be able to do that. So they're engaged in very risky behavior and not showing it like an adult. And I think that's a revelation for a lot of us parents that are concerned about the decisions, our kids are making. Dr. Traynor, let's go back to, so you and Mary Beth are going down this road together, and certainly sounds like it has its shares of ups and downs. But at this critical moment where you two kind of realized, okay, we're going to have to help Matthew. Could you take us to that spot and a little bit about what you're thinking for all the other dads and parents out there for what they might be going through? What did that feel like, and what were you thinking, and how did you take action?
Well, I think the first thing you experience is shock and a little bit of denial. Like, this could never happen to our son or our child. This can't be going on. But on the other hand, we didn't put our head in the sand either. And we were fortunate enough that we had access to help for Matthew. Dr. Hanisch, and he was in treatment. I would say he spent most of his high school years in and out of treatment. And, the interesting thing about the treatment is, on the one hand, it gives you're sad that your child has to go through that, but you're also somewhat, I don't know how to say it, but that they're safe there, that, they're not going to be harmed there, and they're trying to get help. So those days were difficult, Mary Beth alluded to, you have all these aspirations for your child, and then none of those come to fruition. You know, it's very difficult to watch. And everything that Dr. Hanisch mentioned absolutely happened with Matthew. I mean, I think the story is the same for all families that experience a child with addiction. It's just that the personnel is different. You know, Matthew exhibited all the oppositional stuff. He withdrew. He became very argumentative and difficult to deal with. And the further he went in his addiction, the more difficult it was to try to, you know, get him back on track. And he became sort of frozen in an adolescent mind frame. Even when he was, you know, in his 20s, he didn't have that frontal lobe, you know, governor to keep him grounded. I mean, he would fly off the handle and do kind of ridiculously dangerous things that you'd see more from a adolescent or a teenager. So I think his brain development, because of his drug use, was arrested at that point in time. And, you know, I've said this before, you know, what would I do different if I had to reach out to a parent? You know, what could you do to prevent this from happening? And I think the thing to do is to try to just delay it. It's very difficult in the world that we live in to keep them away from drugs and alcohol, because face it, it's ubiquitous. They're legalizing marijuana probably on a national level. That was his drug of choice, and it was very addictive. And in the end, it gave him a marijuana-induced psychosis, you know, at the end of his problem there. So just try to be in tune with what your kids are doing, and if they can delay their use of those things till they get older, till their frontal lobe is developed, they may have a better chance of dealing with it. I think with Matthew, he started so young that once he hardwired his brain to like the substances, I mean, I think it was over for him. He couldn't get better. And I know he wanted to get better, but he just wasn't able to do so. So, you know, try to model your behavior in front of them when they're young. They're watching what you're doing. And, you know, I've said this before, it didn't work out so well for our family with Matthew, but it may work out for your family. So try to get help. There is help out there, and try to reach out any way that you can.
Well, and Mary Beth, anything to add to Mike's remarks? I mean, things you'd like to share with other parents that may be beginning this journey or are further along and dealing with addiction in their family?
I think something important to remember is you don't want that to define who your child is addiction. And always loving them and them knowing you love them. I think it was lonely for Mike and I, or for Mike and me. We, like you said, Dr. Hanisch said, we retreated because it's difficult to have the child that kids shouldn't hang out with. And it was constant fear that Matthew would, you know, hurt himself or hurt someone else in the process. And I think what was really difficult for me, because I've served in the past on years ago we had a task force too that was addressing this even before my kids were old and even in middle school. Looking at this and all of a sudden realizing that your child's a drug dealer, and how do you reconcile that, and how do you come to grips with them, you know, creating this for other kids. And if you try to understand addiction, you can't. And finally, I think towards the end, and Mike and I would sit with him for hours. as he was in a psychosis, and it's quite scary. You not only fear for their life, you fear for your own even. And how can you, who do you reach out to? Even some of our family members were hard on us, like it was our fault. So getting over the fault thing and that you're a terrible parent is hard. However, you have to do your best. And in the end, I think we did our best that we could do with the tools we had. We tried to seek help for Matthew all the time. And of course, we live with the fact that he took his own life because he couldn't deal anymore.
Scott, one of the things that happens, and I think this happens to every family, when you have a child that's going through this, you expend so much energy on that particular child, trying to get them better, that the other kids kind of get left in the dust. And, so they're watching this all unfold and they don't understand it either, so the siblings of an addict have their own issues. Michael was away at college on the East Coast, and he'd come back because he was so far away. He wasn't home that much, but he'd come back on the holidays, and usually Matthew would be home because he'd get a leave from treatment. It'd be Christmas or some holiday, and it would usually turn out to be an absolute disaster because something would happen. And Michael, I could just see the look in his face, like he was so excited to be home, to see his family, but he wanted it to be normal again, and so I don't think you can minimize what this does, not only to parents, but also to brothers and sisters. We had some very good friends. Mara War was on the Matto Foundation. And when things would get pretty tough at home, we would just say to Mara, Tim is coming over. And Mara knew. And he'd go over and hang out with his friend Alec until the storm passed or whatever was going on, and we could get some resolution. But, the addiction affects everyone close to the person that's going through it. And especially if they love that person, which everybody loved Matthew. But it affects the addict so much more. But it's so hard as a society, as a parent, to see that, because the level of frustration is unbelievable. It really is.
Well, Dr. Hanisch, hearing these two share their story, what perspective kind of comes to mind as we hear these? I think looking at these two, this is certainly evidence that this can happen to anyone. This feeling I think we've heard from others that have gone through addiction is that they have a sense of guilt that they carry with them. That's very hard to accept, and that addiction is devastating not just to the person that is addicted, but to the family around them. Kind of hearing that story and looking at those elements, what are some things that come to mind to sort of help us put some words and images and shape to what we can do about this when we're fighting an addiction in our family?
Yeah, well, first, I'd like to just add to what Mike and Mary Beth have said, and it applies to both addictions and just mental health in general. It's not a shameful thing. It's not a character flaw. It's not a sign of bad parenting. It needs to be addressed, and it needs to be discussed openly, the same way any quote unquote physical illness is addressed, and which is why I've so appreciated the Matto Foundation and their approach to things, because the delay decreased defeat. It almost needs to be a large-scale public health imperative, putting it into the context of akin to wearing a seatbelt or having a helmet on your head. It's something we can do to try and keep our kids safe, delaying that onset. Mike made a really good point. It affects everybody, and the siblings are oftentimes neglected and overlooked when it comes to trying to get help for an addict. One of the statistics that are most jarring to me, perhaps, is the fact that if a 13-year-old starts using alcohol, they have about a 47%, I think is the number, 47% chance of developing some type of substance-related, alcohol-related difficulty in adulthood. Whereas if we can delay that till 21, the number goes down to 9%. It's just a huge, huge protective thing to try and prevent early use of alcohol and substances. Marijuana is another one of those. In Matto's case, he developed an actual psychosis induced by that drug, but there's a lot of good, robust evidence that even with somewhat casual use, using it early on prior to the early 20s increases your risk for psychotic illness later on in life. So there's so much evidence and so much support for addressing this awareness education to try and prevent some of this heartbreak.
Well, and thank you for sharing that too. And, this concept of delay, we've talked about the adolescent brain forming. I mean, the impacts of what this does to an adolescent brain versus an adult brain, it's very serious. I like what Dr. Hanisch said. This should be a public health campaign. We used to not put helmets on kids and we didn't put them in seatbelts, but now we do because we know better. And certainly when it comes to addiction and making choices, delaying is something that we can really do. And to echo what Dr. Traynor said is, we may not be able to make a pivot right away, but this is something, if they're going to make a disruptive, if we can delay it, it helps a lot. The later they do this, the more their brain can decrease, the better that we can decrease. And so it has less impact on the brain. And working together, we can defeat addiction. Mary Beth, would you explain a little bit about, since we've got these three up and Dr. Hanisch has just walked us through some of the adolescent brain development, why this is important, but could you share what the Matto Foundation is and what it stands for?
Well, I should let Mike maybe start us out and talk about the inception of the Matto Foundation. So Mike, why don't you tell them how we decided on this?
Okay, well, I guess it's sort of a sad thing can become a positive thing. So after Matthew died, we received all these memorials from friends, relatives, colleagues. And Mary Beth looked at me one day, and she said, "What are we going to do with all this money?" And it was almost like I got struck by a bolt of lightning. But I said, well, here's what I think we should do with it. I said, we should take this money and try to do with it something that we can help somebody else, some other family that's struggling with their child having addiction. I said, so I'm going to call my cousin Pat Traynor at DMF. And, I called Pat on the phone, and neither of us could barely get through the conversation. We were still so sad, about Matthew. But Pat said, yep, I think that's a wonderful idea. Why don't you and Mary Beth come in and we'll see what we can do. And so this is what we've done with it. And, we hope that it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it helps more and more adolescents and kids and more families. Now, one of the things that we've learned going through all this, there's a lot of programs and stuff for adults with addiction, but there isn't a lot for kids. And so our primary focus is with kids and their families. That's what we want the foundation to kind of go forward with. And I spoke about Matthew's older brother, Michael, but I want to speak about Tim a little bit. Now, Tim really was in the middle of this because he wasn't away at college. He was a younger brother, and he was there for all the strife. And he had to go over to the War Was Safe house on many, many occasions when things were going on. You know, the police would be coming to the house. I mean, it was very difficult without going into great detail. But he was sort of terrified of all the drinking and the drugs. And actually, Tim thought of the 3 Ds. You know, Tim was on our is on our foundation, and we were trying to get to a point. What are the things that we can put our heads around? And Tim said, delay, decrease, defeat. Again, it was almost like he got hit by a bolt of lightning. And I mean, I think those 3 words say it. You know, if you can delay your child from doing it, you'll certainly decrease their use, and you may in the end defeat their potential addiction. I don't know, Mary Beth, can you think of anything else that comes?
Yeah, but thanks for, setting that up. I think, for a while we were, definitely just swimming around trying to find what should we do? I think it was Scott who said to us, what is the one thing you could have done differently or you wish you would have done? And I finally we did, both of us, and Tim was there too. Dr. Sarah Crary too was on our, and she's in education. So she was like trying to say, what is it? What can be our message? And, both Mike and I said, never starting. So that's the whole piece on the delay too, is if you want to give your kids a chance in life, and because you don't know what's going to happen, if you want to keep them as smart as they are, if you want to help them keep their executive functioning, because I'll tell you, Matthew couldn't even hold a job down. He was 25 years old. So is to get this message through of not starting. It should be the new seat, car seat, and helmet. Then as you look at decrease too, the whole piece on decrease is looking at college students. North Dakota is binge drinking Shangri-La. It's the greatest place to binge drink. And parents actually think it's a rite of passage. You should go to college and you should do this. Now, that is a place where we really take a look at decreasing use. And instead of going out Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, decreasing that amount and maybe decreasing the amount you drink. These are the things that are simple. I mean, we don't even have to, come up with a pill for this. This is simple. Delaying, parents being the messenger. If you look at the data, it'll show you as parents and their friends have the most impact on what your kids are going to do. And I just wish I would have been more of a force of talking about that, because I'm not a drinker. I don't even drink anymore because I don't like it. But I wish I would have talked more about it and about, no, it's not what everybody does, because that's what the kids think. Well, everybody's doing it. Well, it's not the case. So I really feel, and this is something, is the norming has to change. And parents, you have to take this, your child's brain, as serious as you take bike helmets, seat belts, car seats, everything you've done for your child. This is so important. Don't give up, and adolescents, keep going.
After Matthew died, I went to visit one of Dr. Hanisch's colleagues who also took care of Matthew. And the night he took his own life, he came into the cabin. He was inebriated, could hardly talk, and he wanted to go out. It was cold, and he wanted to go out fishing for muskies in the middle of the night. And I had an argument with him. I said, no, you can't do that. You're not going to go out. You're under the influence, and it's not safe. The water just is too cold and it's dark. You can't go by yourself and do that. And, you know, I regretted that, you know, because we had an argument that night. But Dr. Hanisch's colleague said to me, well, you were trying to protect him. He said, if he was a little kid, would you let him go play in the street? You'd say, no, you can't go play in the street, Matthew. And you know what? You have to, as Mary Beth said, you as a parent are the ones that can protect your child from this stuff. And as difficult as it might be sometimes, it's okay to say, no, you're not going to that party. No, you're not going to hang out with this group of people, you know, but have an alternative for them. You know, we tried to provide that for Matthew all the time. In fact, I think he got sick of hanging out with the two of us and with his brothers. But we tried to divert that as much as we could. But at that point in time, it was almost too late. He'd already was in the turmoils and the tumbling of the addiction. But at the beginning, you know, looking back on it, maybe we needed to intercede a little bit more. And as a parent, I would urge you to do that. Do positive things with your family and model positive behavior, because they are certainly watching you, believe me, at a very young age. Isn't that right, Dr. Hanisch?
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. I could not have said that any better. You don't be afraid to say no, and know where your children are. It's your responsibility after all. It's a daily struggle that I have in my practice with parents who are afraid of saying no, who are afraid to limit access to screens and social media, who are afraid to rein in the kids when really their heart's desire is to protect their kids, but they are worried about the fallout, what might happen. And the other part is setting that example. Is they do as we do, not as we say. I also think that people in general and kids too are much more likely to follow the rules if they understand the why behind them. And so using this information as an educational tool and saying, no, it's not okay to be drinking in a safe environment in your friend's basement because dad are there, and you're not going to be driving because your brain is not developed. And I don't care that you're going to be quote unquote safe, but this is why we don't do that. Educating them about the real differences between adult brains and kids' brains. It gives us something to work with other than just parents saying you can't because I say so and it's against the law. That doesn't go very well with a lot of teenagers. So absolutely, I agree with everything you just said, Mike.
Well, I think this gives us, a great place to move towards the close of this conversation, and just echoing Dr. Hanisch's summation that talking about the brain gives us a really good place to start rather than just getting into an argument. And I think that's a tool that many of us parents have never heard of before and is an incredibly valuable one. And, the brain is still forming, and using drugs and alcohol not only puts you at risk of becoming addicted, but also damaging your development as a person. We want a whole healthy brain because we want you to meet your full potential. And so I think that gives us a lot to work with. Well, as we move to a close, we'll do closing remarks, starting with you, Mary Beth. Final words you'd like to share with the parents that are watching this, or teachers or coaches.
Well, my final words too would be to please have these conversations. I think we steer away from them, or we think we can't have these conversations with our children. And if we're a teacher or we're a coach or we're even a friend, have these conversations and talk about delaying. You you can go into it and say, you know, I'm not saying you're never going to drink, because you will, you know, it's legal at 21, but I'm telling you why there's a legal drinking age, because your brain isn't ready. And it's okay to be that parent.
Very good. And Dr. Traynor, closing remarks on your behalf of what you'd like to share with those watching.
Well, you know, having kids doesn't come with that owner's manual or a playbook, right? So you have to roll with the punches as they come at you. But if something like this happens to your child, don't retreat, don't run for cover. Try to stand up to the problem at hand. Get in line with the rest of your family, the ones that are supportive. And as a parent, everybody's always trying to do the best that they can do. And remember, you're going to make mistakes along the way, like all parents do. But that's okay. You just have to do your best for all of your kids, not only the ones that might be struggling with mental illness or addiction, but even the ones that aren't, because they're suffering as well. And remember, you're not alone. There's a lot of people out there that have suffered and are enduring the same kinds of problems that you might be. And try to reach out for help, whether it's someone like Dr. Hanisch, a minister, counselor, a good friend. I mean, they can be comforting not only to the person that's having the addiction, but also a great comfort to you going forward. You're not alone.
Well, and Dr. Hanisch, closing remarks you'd like to share with our audience about today's topic.
Yeah, thanks. The more we talk about this, the less shame will be associated with it. Mental illness, substance abuse. Talk to your family, talk to your kids. If you're really at a loss of where to go to begin with, I'm a huge supporter of the caring family physician or pediatrician, and they can be a good place to start for resources. Don't get caught in a trap of feeling ashamed and feeling like a failure. There is help out there, and use the science that is there to help drive some of those decisions and help you make the right ones. And I agree, you're not alone in this.
And
Well,
Scott, I'd just like to say one more thing. Can you imagine if we got everybody behind this? What it really might be.
Well, I think if, imagining that is what these sessions are about. It's what Level Up is here for. It's what Matto Foundation is on a mission to do. And I think that's the invitation we have for everybody watching is to join this movement. And let's talk about it. Let's get rid of the stigma around it. We now know, thanks to the bravery of both you, Mary Beth, and Mike Traynor, for sharing your story, that this really can happen to anybody, regardless of who you are. And that you're not alone. You're going to feel some things, but don't give up hope and get help. And there's a lot of us going through this. And now walking through what Matto Foundation has put together. And Dr. Hanisch, thank you so much for sharing the science behind this. About our duty really is to help do the best we can to delay the use of drugs and alcohol. And if they're going to use, that we decrease it as much as we possibly can, because of brain development, not just because it could spiral out of control. Because with kids, if-thens may not understand, but they could understand lack of potential. We don't want to take your potential away from you. So we want to help you. And if we all do that, we all start talking about it, we all connect, we make room to get resources and to work together, we can defeat this, and we can make sure that we can save more lives than what we currently do. I want to thank Mike and Mary Beth Traynor for your bravery and for opening up both your hearts and your minds with us today. Thank you so much for sharing your story. And Dr. Hanisch, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise and for all the good work you do in our community. Join us next month. Again, it's always the first Thursday of the month. And next month, we'll be having Helping Youth Build Positive Connections with special guest John Fisher. Once again, thanks everybody for joining, and thank you, trainers and Dr. Hanisch. This is a very productive and fruitful conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, for all you do as well. And Dakota Medical Foundation has been fabulous for us and many, many other organizations in this region. Great asset.
Thank you.